Before we get started, a quick reminder. The Crime Shack is listener-supported. If you'd like to help us keep telling these stories, you'll find the support link in the show notes or at thecrimeshack.com. The Crime Shack exists because of listeners like you. Your support makes each episode possible. Check out the link in the show notes or visit thecrimeshack.com to join our community.
The death of a 21-year-old Agnes Wanjiru stunned the country when details emerged that a British troop allegedly stabbed her to death and dumped her in a septic tank in Nanyuki. However, more than a year since the revelation, investigations have yet to commence into her death.
There is no emergency call associated with this case, no dispatcher's voice, no recorded panic. Instead, there is silence, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was allowed to stay buried. Welcome back to the Crime Shack. I'm your host, Michelle Pense, and this is episode 46. This podcast contains content that may not be suitable for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. In 2012, a young Kenyan woman named Agnes Wanjiru vanished after a night out in the small town of Nairobi. She didn't leave a note or run off. She didn't resurface the next morning. She simply disappeared. What followed was not urgency, but delay. Not answers, but silence. Days turned into weeks. The men last seen with Agnes weren't locals, and they weren't just passing through. They belonged to an institution that doesn't answer to local pressure, only to its own chain of command and the politics that come with it. This is not just a story about a woman who went missing. It's a story about power, about what happens when borders blur responsibility, when jurisdiction becomes a shield, and when a single life is weighed against international alliances. Agnes Wanjiru was born around 1990 and grew up in Nairobi, Kenya's capital and largest city. Home to more than 4 million people, Nairobi is a place of sharp contrasts. Modern glass office towers and international hotels sit just blocks from informal settlements made of corrugated tin and scrap wood. It's a fast-growing city, crowded and loud, full of ambition, but also inequality. Jobs exist, opportunity is visible, yet for many families it's unstable and fleeting. Survival often depends on who you know, where you're born, and how close you are to power. It's a city where hope and hardship live side by side every single day. Those who knew Agnes described her as social, warm, and outgoing. She enjoyed music, she liked conversation, and liked feeling connected to people. Before Agnes Wanjiru ever became a headline, she was simply Agnes. A young woman rooted in a place that felt like the whole world. She was born in the market town of Nanyuki. Nanyuki is a small town in central Kenya that sits just south of the equator at the base of Mount Kenya. It's a quiet town with dusty roads, bars, guest houses, and small shops. Agnes lived in that town all 21 years of her life. And if she ever traveled, her family says it was usually just to visit relatives, not to chase some big, faraway dream, but to stay connected to the people who had always been her safety net. Agnes was raised by her mother, Lydia Wanjiru Kamotho, a woman who kept a household afloat through what the family called side hustle jobs, farming, or whatever work could be found, whatever paid in time to feed and clothe 5 children. Agnes was the youngest, the last in a line of older siblings who always seemed a few steps ahead of her. Rose, then their brother James, then Cecilia, then Francisca, then Agnes, the baby of the family. She was loved in that specific youngest child way, fussed over, teased, kept a little closer than the others. Not because she was fragile, but because everyone quietly expected her to be the one who could lift the mood, the one who brought light into a room without trying. In school, Agnes wasn't described as a troublemaker or a wild child. She attended DEB primary and later Gakawa secondary, and her family remembers her as someone who genuinely enjoyed learning, especially literature. Words mattered to her, stories mattered to her, and maybe that's why the people who loved her say she could turn an ordinary moment into something warm. A joke in the kitchen, a grin you couldn't help but return, the kind of laughter that spreads across a room and makes everyone feel like they belong. She also loved music. Family members say she was often caught singing or dancing. She spent time in the kitchen, stayed close to her extended family, and took her role as an aunt seriously. She looked after younger nieces, helped at home, and was described as dependable, kind, and funny. Her niece Esther remembered it like this. Agnes was always joking and smiling, always pulling laughter out of people. Not to be the center of attention, but because that's who she was, the one who made the heavy days feel lighter. And then there was hair. When Agnes was younger, she loved to braid her niece's hair. Eventually, she decided to make that skill her future. She began training as a hairdresser in 2010, and she finished her course in August 2011. It should have been the beginning of a new chapter, the kind of step forward that feels small to outsiders, but huge to the person living it. But life was moving fast. On the surface, the town of Nanyuki is serene. Being a stopping point for those looking to summit Mount Kenya, the town caters to tourists and expats. But Nanyuki is also shaped by something else, a long-standing foreign military presence that has altered the town's economy, nightlife, and power dynamics for decades. The British Army has trained in Kenya since the colonial era. Today, thousands of British troops rotate through the region under the banner of partnership and cooperation. Officially, it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. The UK gets a major realistic training environment, and Kenya gets money, skills training, and security cooperation. Essentially, the UK and Kenya have partnered up throughout history. They've trained together, shared information, and helped each other respond to threats. Unofficially, it has created a parallel reality, one where young soldiers cycle in and out, spend time and money freely, and operate within a system that often insulates them from local consequence. While she was finishing her hairdresser training, Agnes became pregnant. Her daughter, Stacy, was born on October 20th, 2011. Agnes's niece said Agnes described becoming a mother as the best feeling ever. She adored her baby, the kind of love that reorganizes your whole body around protecting this tiny person. But love doesn't pay the rent, and it certainly doesn't buy baby formula. Agnes struggled to provide for her daughter. Her family had said that, like many young women in Nanyuki, a town with the steady flow of money from the British training base, Agnes sometimes made extra money through sex work. Not because it was there or because she had a child, but because sometimes survival shows up wearing choices that don't feel like choices at all. While you listen to this episode and when you hear what happened to Agnes Wanjiru, I don't want you to picture a stereotype. I want you to picture a family's youngest child who stayed close to home, a student who loved literature, a woman who sang and danced in her kitchen, an aunt who braided hair, a newly trained hairdresser who hadn't even had the time to properly begin, a mother 5 months postpartum who loved her daughter with everything she had. And that's who she still is to the people who have carried her name for more than a decade, waiting for the world to treat her life like it mattered. For a lot of businesses in Nanyuki, the soldiers are steady money. They come in groups, they spend, they tip, they keep bars, hotels, and taxi drivers busy. But for local civilians, especially women, it's not that simple. Because when you mix cash and alcohol with language barriers and a clear imbalance of power, the lines don't just blur, they move. What looks like a normal night out on the surface can carry pressure underneath it, the kind you don't always see unless you live there. And that's the part people don't like to talk about. Consent doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists inside real life. Rent due, kids to feed, jobs that don't pay enough, and men with money who can leave tomorrow. In that kind of environment, survival can start to wear the mask of choice. And Agnes was doing her best to navigate that world. On the night of March 31st, 2012, Agnes thought it was just going to be a normal night. A few drinks, some music, the kind of evening where you laugh a little louder than you mean to, and the hours feel easy. Nothing about it would have felt like the beginning of a tragedy. That night, she was seen out in Nanyuki, socializing and drinking with a group of British soldiers. Witnesses would later describe her moving between bars. She appeared to be happy. She was talking, laughing, having conversation. As the night wore on, the group relocated to the Lions Court Lodge, a 37-room guest house. This wasn't unusual, as the Lions Court was known as a place where British troops liked to gather. The staff recognized them, and the locals understood the pattern. The hotel functioned quietly as an extension of the military's off-duty world. What happened next is the most important part of this story, and the least documented. That night, Agnes never returned home. She left no note, no sign of where she could have gone or where she was. Her family became concerned after days passed, then weeks, with no word of Agnes. In Kenya, missing persons cases are often slow to mobilize, especially when the missing person is a young woman without status or resources. Then, 2 months later, on May 5, 2012, the truth of what happened to Agnes surfaced in the most brutal way possible. During a search of the Lions Court property, authorities located Agnes's body. She was found inside a septic tank behind the Lions Court Lodge. She was naked, her remains were badly beaten and decomposed, and she'd been stabbed. And her body was placed somewhere meant to be ignored. This wasn't just a murder, it was a disposal. Someone had made a series of decisions after Agnes died. Those decisions required time and privacy. Those decisions also suggested a level of confidence that they would not be caught, or that it would not matter if they were. An examination of her remains showed that she suffered stab wounds to her chest and abdomen, had a collapsed lung, and had blunt force injury to the chest. Due to the decomposed condition of her remains, it could not be determined if she had been sexually assaulted. Almost immediately, attention turned to the men that Agnes had last been seen with. In the days after the discovery of her body, Kenyan police questioned hotel staff, bar workers, and locals who had seen Agnes the night she disappeared. The same details surfaced again and again. British soldiers drinking the Lion's Court. Kenyan police quietly identified a British soldier as their prime suspect, but no name was made public. Witnesses confirmed Agnes had been with British troops that night, and rumors circulated openly in Nanyuki, and, according to later reporting, within the military unit itself. Some soldiers allegedly knew exactly what had happened, and some knew exactly who was responsible. But before an arrest could be made, the British soldier who was their primary suspect left the military base in Kenya and went back to the United Kingdom. No news report was made or public announcement, no extradition request was issued, and no explanation was offered to Agnes's family. By the time investigators began to circle closer, he was already outside the reach of Kenyan law, protected by distance and diplomacy. And in that moment, Agnes Wanjiru became more than a victim. She became a test of whether justice could survive power. For decades, the British Army had operated in Kenya under agreements that gave it wide latitude. Soldiers trained there, lived there temporarily, and when things went wrong, they could be recalled, quietly, efficiently, and without explanation to local authorities. It didn't take long for Agnes's case to become trapped inside that system. Kenyan investigators ran into the same problem they'd seen before: a wall of silence. Every request for help moved at a crawl. Emails and calls went unanswered. And while they waited, the clock kept working against them. The kind of evidence you have to grab right away, like forensic samples, interviews inside the military, and even basic records of who was there that night, all started to disappear or become impossible to get back. Meanwhile, within the military ranks, the night Agnes died did not disappear. According to later reporting, soldiers talked amongst themselves about what happened that night. They whispered. They knew. There were accounts of fellow troops openly discussing who had been with Agnes, who had taken her back to the hotel, and what happened afterward. But knowing something internally and admitting it publicly are two very different things, especially in the military when silence is often rewarded. For Agnes's family, the wait was agonizing. The days turned into months, then years. They waited for updates that never came and watched officials promise updates and reviews that led nowhere. It was quite obvious that the case was not a priority. And it wasn't a priority because Agnes didn't matter, but because pursuing her killer would require confronting a very powerful foreign ally. Back in the United Kingdom, the UK Ministry of Defense maintained a careful distance. Statements on the matter were always vague and responsibility was deflected. The official position was cooperation, but cooperation without urgency, without transparency, and without consequences. What happened to Agnes Wanjiru did not exist in isolation. Long before her body was discovered behind the Lion's Court Lodge, there had been other stories. Women who had said something bad had happened and learned very quickly that nothing would come of it. By the time Agnes was killed, the arrangement between Kenya and the British military was routine, something that had gone on for so many years it was part of the culture. Both governments had incentive to keep the partnership smooth, quiet, and free of scandal. After the initial shock faded, Nanyuki returned to its day-to-day routines. Bars reopened and soldiers continued to rotate through. The Lions Court remained in business, and life seemed to move forward, just not for Agnes's family. Her mother spoke publicly about the pain of knowing her daughter's killer had simply been allowed to leave the country. She spoke about the cruelty of uncertainty, of watching time pass while nothing changed or moved forward on her daughter's case, about the sense that her daughter's life had been deemed expendable. And she wasn't wrong. For nearly a decade, Agnes Wanjiru's name faded from public conversation. That was until her story got into the hands of journalists. In 2021, British investigative reporters reopened the case. They spoke to former soldiers, which included men no longer bound by active service, who were willing to divulge the dark secrets they had known for years. And what emerged was devastating. Multiple sources alleged that the identity of Agnes's killer had been known within the unit almost immediately. The soldiers' superiors were aware of the incident, and no serious attempt had been made to hold the suspect accountable before he was sent home. When the investigative reporters finally began pulling at the threads and digging into the evidence, they uncovered more than negligence. They revealed an environment where soldiers felt protected, where accountability was theoretical, not real. Former service members described a culture of bravado and entitlement during deployments, heavy drinking and little oversight after hours, a sense that what happened in Kenya stayed in Kenya. The reporting did what years of quiet diplomacy had failed to do. It embarrassed the institution. The public pressure mounted. Questions were asked in Parliament, and Kenyan officials demanded answered and renewed calls for justice. The Ministry of Defense finally acknowledged the allegations.
The UK says it will cooperate fully with the authorities in Kenya in relation to the death of a woman nearly a decade ago. Agnes Wanjiru was found dead in central Kenya in 2012 after she had reportedly been at a hotel near a British Army base. An inquest in Kenya concluded that she'd been murdered by British soldiers, as our correspondent Ferdinand Amondi reports now.
There were statements, promises, internal reviews, and pledges of cooperation. But acknowledgement is not accountability, and to this day, no one has been tried for Agnes's murder. For years, her family has remained trapped in limbo, knowing that answers exist, knowing that people with power know what happened, and knowing that justice has been delayed long enough to feel deliberate. If Agnes had been British, this case would not be unresolved. If her killer had been Kenyan, this case would not be forgotten. And that may be the most disturbing part of this story. Not that Agnes Wanjiru was murdered, but that so many people knew and nothing happened. But the one thing that would have meant something, the thing Agnes's family needed, still didn't happen. No arrest, no charges, and no trial. And Agnes Wanjiru stayed what she'd been for years in the eyes of the system, a name everyone could acknowledge without anyone being held responsible. Her case exposed a truth that many post-colonial nations understand instinctively. Power doesn't always need to break the law to evade it. Sometimes it just needs to wait, and waiting has consequences. The older cases become, the more memories of witnesses begin to fade, and evidence slowly degrades. Years went by without resolution. Promises of movement came and went, but nothing changed. The story would briefly return to the news, reopen the pain, and then slip back into obscurity. But then, something did happen. On September 16, 2025, for the first time, a suspect was publicly named. A Nairobi High Court issued an arrest warrant for a British national in connection with Agnes's murder. The suspect was Robert James Purkis. Purkis had been a medic and a private in the British Army who had been stationed in Kenya. He was 20 years old at the time Agnes disappeared in March 2012 and had left the military years ago and had returned to civilian life in the UK. And according to witness accounts uncovered by journalists, Purkis was allegedly the last person seen with Agnes on the night she was killed. Kenyan immediately moved toward extradition.
Responsible to be brought to justice because Agnes and her family have already had to wait too long for these cases to be resolved. We need that now to be investigated and brought to the courts here in Kenya as quickly as possible, and any further allegations that come to light will be dealt with the same urgency on our part.
In November 2025, Purkis was arrested in the UK and appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court contesting extradition. He was refused bail, and his lawyers state that he vigorously denied any involvement in the murder. But prosecutors have a different story. They allege that Purkis had confessed to fellow soldiers, including remarks described as, quote, sex that went wrong, and that a post-mortem indicated she may have been alive when placed in the tank. There's a moment in this case that makes my stomach drop, because it suggests that inside Purkis' unit, at least some people weren't just aware, they were referencing it like an inside joke. According to ITV News, a UK news programming network, during extradition proceedings, the court heard about messages and reactions tied to the night Agnes was last seen. One member of the regiment reportedly posted a photo outside the Lions Court Lodge with the caption, quote, "If you know, you know." Purkis allegedly responded to that, not with shock, not with fear, but with a smiling face emoji. And let me be really clear here. The full chat logs have not been released publicly. These are publicly distributed excerpts that journalists say the court was told. But even in those short chats, you can hear the tone. The if you know energy, the wink and nod. The kind of message that only makes sense if the people reading it already understand what happened, or at least what they believe happened. There was also leaked screenshots and messages where soldiers allegedly mocked the case with emojis and short comments, including references to a septic tank. Among those who knew, this wasn't treated like a tragedy. It was treated like something to joke about. And then there's one more piece that's important to separate from the messages, because it wasn't during a phone chat between soldiers. It's an alleged spoken statement referenced in reporting and court context. That a colleague saw Purkis crying outside the hotel, and he allegedly said, quote, "I've killed her." As of the date of this podcast, Purkis has denied any wrongdoing and is innocent until proven guilty, and the case is still moving through legal channels. But when you put all this side by side, the reported excerpts, the tone, the alleged confession, it paints a picture that is hard to ignore. Not just of what happened to Agnes, but of how easily the people around it could treat it like background noise, like a story they could bury, like a secret they could laugh about. As this new development unfolds, let us be reminded that Agnes's story matters, not just because it's sensational, but because it's unfinished. It's been almost 14 years since Agnes Wanjiru was murdered, and she did not disappear into silence by accident. Silence was placed around her, carefully and deliberately, with the quiet confidence that time would do the rest. She was someone's daughter, someone's laughter, someone's future, a young woman with a name, a family, and a life that mattered long before it was taken. And for years it felt like her name would never reach a courtroom. But now, for the first time in over a decade, the wall that protected this case has started to crack with the arrest of ex-soldier Robert Purkis. It doesn't undo what was done to Agnes, and it doesn't guarantee an outcome, but it finally suggests something her family has been denied for far too long: that her death might actually demand an answer. Her story forces us to sit with an unbearable truth. Justice is often delayed not because the truth is unknown, but because it is inconvenient. But it also offers a fragile hope that inconvenience may no longer be enough. When power crosses borders without accountability, silence becomes policy and time becomes an accomplice. But when the world finally refuses to look away, even time can be made to turn back toward the truth. That's it, friends. Thank you for listening to this episode and for your continued support. If this episode mattered to you, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps keep Agnes Wanjiru's story visible and reaching other listeners. Head over to thecrimeshack.com and check out my new website where you can find all my episodes and more. And be sure to connect with me on social media and subscribe to my podcast on whatever platform you listen to your podcasts so you don't miss the next episode. Until next time, stay safe, everyone. Every episode we make is fueled by listener support. If you'd like to help us create more, you'll find the link in the show notes or at thecrimeshack.com.